A tank that the British War Office stubbornly tried to bury at the drawing board stage, contrary to all logic, became the most mass-produced armored shield of the Empire. Friends, meet the British Valentine infantry tank. How did a solitary designer manage to outsmart military officials and literally force them to adopt the machine? Why did the British in the sands of Africa consider it a death trap, while Soviet tankers demanded deliveries of these machines until the very end of the war? Today we will analyze little-known facts that have long remained in the shadow of official chronicles. Too many uncomfortable questions hide in the history of the legendary Valentine. Watch this video to the end, and you will learn what hidden design secrets saved the lives of Soviet crews, and why this slow-moving vehicle victoriously reached Berlin when all others had already been scrapped. Let us begin. There is a pattern in the history of technology. The one who invents something first does not always turn out to be the best at it 20 years later. Sometimes a pioneer is so preoccupied with their own invention that they stop developing it, whereas those who arrive later look at someone else's work with fresh eyes and make it better. This is precisely what happened to British tank building. In 1916, Great Britain used tanks in battle for the first time in world history on the Somme River in France. The machines were bulky, slow, and unreliable, but they existed, and no other army in the world had them, making Britain a technological monopolist. By the end of the First World War, the British tank industry had accumulated colossal experience, with thousands of machines, dozens of modifications, and active engineers with practical knowledge. It seemed like an ideal starting position to remain number one in the world during the 1920s and 1930s. But something went wrong. In the 1920s, British designers were indeed active. Vickers created the 6-ton Vickers Mark E tank, which was a real breakthrough. Light, maneuverable, and equipped with a decent gun, it was a very successful machine by the standards of the time, entering the international market and spreading across the globe. Finland bought it, Poland bought it, China bought it, as did Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, and many others. The Soviet Union not only bought it, but also took a license to produce its own version under the name T-26, which became the main Soviet light tank in the early years of the war. But there is an irony that is hard to ignore. While other countries were buying British developments and building their own tank programs on their basis, Great Britain itself was gradually losing momentum. This was not because the engineers got worse, but because the problem lay elsewhere. In the 1930s, the British War Office could not decide what kind of tank it needed, and debates over doctrine went on for years. Some officers believed that tanks should act quickly and independently, which led to the so-called cruiser tanks. Others insisted that the main task of armored vehicles was to support the infantry in the offensive, moving alongside the soldiers, which led to infantry tanks. Both concepts made sense, but the problem was that while the debates raged, concrete machines did not appear, and those that did suffer from compromises that pleased everyone and satisfied no one. By the mid-1930s, it became obvious that a reboot was needed. The industry received new assignments, and designers sat down at their drawing boards. The British tank industry was essentially starting over, possessing experience but almost no ready-made designs. It is important to understand that this reboot yielded very uneven results, with some projects failing while others turned out quite decent. But it was during this period, in the late 1930s, that the story of the tank we are talking about today began. This was the very machine that the military initially rejected, then accepted without much enthusiasm, and later discovered that it fought everywhere, from North Africa to the Eastern Front, and did so much better than anyone had expected. To understand how this became possible, we must address one fundamental question. What did the British military actually want from their tanks, and what task were they supposed to solve? The answer to this question determined everything, both the appearance of the Valentine and its fate. To understand why the Valentine was needed in the first place, we must pause for a moment, because the British tank classification system was not just bureaucracy. It was the reflection of an entire military philosophy, without which the story of this machine loses half its meaning. In the 1,930 seconds, the British Army divided all tanks into two fundamentally different classes. The first class consisted of cruiser tanks, whose task was speed and maneuverability. They acted like the cavalry of past centuries, breaking into the rear, intercepting communications, and creating chaos. Their armor was relatively thin, but their speed was high. In short, they were a strike force designed to hit quickly and disengage. The second class was infantry tanks, representing a completely different philosophy. Their task was not speed, but protection. They had to walk alongside the infantry, cover the soldiers, and suppress enemy firing points, moving at a walking pace of about 8 kilometers per hour. However, their armor had to be thick enough to withstand the fire of anti-tank guns. The logic was clear, but the practice proved more complicated. The first production infantry tank was the Matilda I, officially designated as Infantry Tank Mark I. It was a small vehicle weighing about 11 tons with serious armor for the time, up to 60 millimeters in the frontal section. But its armament consisted only of a machine gun, without any cannon. This was a deliberate choice, as the military reasoned that an infantry tank did not need a cannon. Its job was to suppress enemy infantry and support its own soldiers, which a machine gun could handle, leaving anti-tank work to others. Today, such logic seems strange, but in the mid-1930s it made some sense, at least until enemy anti-tank artillery became a common occurrence on every kilometer of the front. The second infantry tank was the Matilda II, officially Infantry Tank Mark II. This machine was a completely different story. 26 tons, armor up to 78 millimeters, thicker than that of many mid-war tanks, and a 40 millimeter gun, making it a very well-protected vehicle by the standards of 1940. In 1940, in France, the Matilda II made a strong impression, as German 37 millimeter anti-tank guns practically could not penetrate it, which was an unpleasant surprise for the enemy. However, the Matilda II had a problem that was rarely mentioned in official articles. It was expensive and labor-intensive to manufacture, featuring a complex design, a lot of manual labor, and specific components. Under the conditions of escalating wartime production, this became an increasingly serious limitation, making it very difficult to produce 1,000 Matildas within a reasonable time frame when the Army demanded thousands. In addition, 26 tons was a significant weight. The Matilda crossed bridges with difficulty, struggled with soft ground, and required a powerful tractor for evacuation from the battlefield, and for all its armor, it reached a maximum of 24 kilometers per hour on the highway, which was normal for an infantry tank, but made it a highly inflexible machine. The industry watched this situation with growing concern, as the Army needed tanks, many tanks, and fast, while the Matilda was a low-volume product that required too much time and resources. Against this background, a new assignment appeared in 1937. The military wanted a third infantry tank weighing about 15 tons, which would be lighter than the Matilda and simpler to produce, but would retain the same philosophy of protection, infantry support, and potential for further modernization. The contract went to Vickers, and the work was led by Chief Engineer Leslie Little, the man who had already created the 6-ton Vickers Mark E that spread across the world, and a man who understood very well the difference between what the customer wanted and what actually worked. He already had a ready-made answer to this question. Leslie Little was not a public person. He did not give interviews, write memoirs, or speak at conferences. He was an engineer in the classic sense of the word, a person who thought in blueprints and solved problems with metal. But what he did with the Valentine project speaks louder than any words. By 1937, he had the 6-ton Vickers Mark E under his belt, a tank bought by more than 20 countries, which was not an accident or luck, but the result of concrete engineering thinking. Use proven solutions, do not overcomplicate unless necessary, and keep the weight within reasonable limits. When the order came for a new infantry tank weighing about 15 tons, Little did not start from scratch. He had a ready-made base, the A-10 tank, which Vickers was developing as an infantry tank, but which was ultimately reclassified as a cruiser. In essence, the A-10 was a development of that same Vickers Mark E, only heavier and with reinforced armor. Little took this chassis, redesigned it, and on February 10, 1938, presented the first version of the new tank under the code name Valentine to the military. Why Valentine? There is still no official explanation. One version suggests that the project was submitted to the War Office on the eve of St. Valentine's Day, February 14th. Another version claims it was simply an internal Vickers codename carrying no symbolism, and history has not preserved a precise answer. Returning to the machine itself, Little proposed a tank with 60 millimeters of armor around the entire perimeter, not just in the front, but everywhere. This was a conscious choice. An infantry tank operates in conditions where fire can come from any direction, including the flanks and at short distances, so frontal armor helps but does not save the day. The armament was a 40mm rapid-fire Vickers gun, and the turret was a two-man design with a three-man crew, a driver in the hull and 2 men in the turret, the commander, who also acted as the gunner, and the loader. The weight of the vehicle turned out to be around 16 tons, slightly over the original requirement, but within reasonable limits. On paper, everything looked logical. Serious armor, a decent gun, manageable weight, and a design based on proven assemblies with no risky experiments. The military looked at the project and said no. There were several objections, the main one being the two-man turret. British military doctrine by that time had concluded that a tank commander should not combine their duties with the gunner's job. They needed to observe the battlefield, make decisions, and command the crew, which required a separate gunner, meaning a three-man turret and a crew of 4. In addition, the military wanted to increase the armor to 75mm, reasoning that if they were making an infantry tank, it should be truly protected. This sounded reasonable, but Little immediately saw the problem. A three-man turret meant a larger turret ring diameter, which required a wider hull or a major redesign of the entire structure, and an additional crew member added weight, volume, and ventilation needs. Moreover, increasing the armor to 75mm instead of 60 would add several more tons, meaning that the light, maneuverable 16-ton infantry tank would turn into a 25-ton vehicle with a different engine, a different suspension, and a different production cost. Essentially, it would no longer be a modification, but an entirely new tank. Little refused to redesign the project, not out of stubbornness for stubbornness' sake, but because he understood that while each of the military's demands seemed reasonable on its own, together they destroyed the very idea of the machine. A light, simple, mass-produced infantry tank was precisely what the Army needed, not another Matilda, only worse. The military officially rejected the project. At this point, a detail emerges that speaks volumes. Almost all British tanks of that period received an alphanumeric designation consisting of A followed by a serial number, A9, A10, A11, A12, which was the standard system for tracking combat vehicles in the War Office, assigned when a tank was officially accepted for consideration. The Valentine never received such a designation because the military did not even consider it. They rejected it, and Vickers continued the work at its own risk and expense, without an official order or a registry designation. This was a critical moment. The company invested its own resources into a project that the Army officially did not want, and Little continued to work on the machine knowing there was no contract or guarantee behind it, confident that he would be proven right, and waiting for the moment when this would become obvious to everyone else. That moment came sooner than many expected. There are two ways to create a good machine. The first is to take the best components in existence and assemble them together, which looks impressive on paper, but results in a costly, complex, and high-maintenance vehicle. The second way is to take proven components that already work in real-world conditions and combine them intelligently, resulting in humbler specifications on paper, but allowing the vehicle to be produced by the thousands, repaired in the field, and operated for years without catastrophic failures. Leslie Little chose the second path, and he did so deliberately. Let us start with the armor. 60mm around the entire perimeter was not an accidental figure. To understand the scale, take an ordinary metal ruler, about 2mm thick. The Valentine's armor was 30 times thicker, and this applied all around, not just to the front. Why was this so important for an infantry tank? Because an infantry tank does not break into the rear at high speed, leaving the enemy behind. It operates in close combat among houses, trenches, and anti-tank guns that can fire from any direction, making side armor just as important as frontal armor. Little understood this, whereas the military, who wanted 75mm only on the front, understood it less. Now, about the turret. A two-man design with a 40mm gun. The military wanted a three-man turret, which, as we know, caused the conflict. However, looking at the numbers, the two-man turret allowed the turret ring diameter, the opening in the hull through which the turret is mounted and rotates, to remain compact, which meant a narrower hull, less weight, a less powerful engine, and a simpler, cheaper, and more reliable design. Everything was connected. Pull one thread and the whole structure unravels. Next, the engine. Here begins a story that at first sounds like a joke. The first production Valentines were fitted with the AECA 189 engine, a petrol engine producing 150 horsepower developed by the Associated Equipment Company, which had previously been used in London buses. Yes, London buses. When skeptics found out about this, their reaction was predictable. A combat tank with a bus engine seemed absurd, a temporary stopgap until a proper engine was made. In reality, this was one of the smartest decisions in the entire project. By 1940, the bus engine had undergone years of verification in real-world operations, not on a test bench, but on the streets of London in any weather, with full loads and with thousands of hours of runtime, meaning its resource lifespan, weak points, and maintenance requirements were thoroughly known. Additionally, spare parts existed in huge quantities, as did mechanics who knew how to repair it, which was no small detail in wartime. It was the difference between a tank that could be repaired in a few hours and one that waited weeks for a rare part. Later, diesel engines were introduced to the Valentine, first British Bedford ones and then American ones from General Motors. The official output of these American diesels was listed as 125 to 130 horsepower, but a curious detail is that the versions actually installed in the Valentine produced around 160 horsepower, resulting in speeds higher than the official specifications, up to 25 kilometers per hour off-road and slightly more on the highway. Regarding assembly, British factories initially faced a shortage of qualified armor welders. Welding armor plate is not like welding water pipes. It is a distinct trade requiring experience and precision. Little solved the problem pragmatically. Some of the hulls were assembled using bolts and rivets, an old technology well known to any factory. Although not as light as a welded structure, since bolted connections add some weight, it was accessible to any metalworking enterprise. This decision expanded the circle of factories capable of producing the Valentine, directly boosting production rates. The final combat weight of the machine was 16 tons, whereas the Matilda II weighed 26 tons. The 10-ton difference was not just a number. It affected bridge loads, fuel consumption, and transport or evacuation requirements. A 16-ton tank could cross where a 26-ton vehicle would get stuck or break a crossing. Looking at the design of the Valentine as a whole, one begins to understand Little's logic. Every decision, armor, turret, engine, assembly, was subordinated to a single goal. Not to create the best tank in the world, but to create a tank that could be produced by the thousands, operate in the field without constant specialist attention, and still get the job done. In wartime, this is far more valuable than record-breaking specifications on paper. The military did not understand this yet, but they were about to learn from experience. By 1938, Great Britain lived in a state of growing anxiety. In March of that year, Germany annexed Austria, and in September, the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia. Europe was moving toward a major war at a speed that could no longer be ignored, and the British Army looked at its equipment stores and realized that what they had was categorically insufficient. Against this backdrop, the War Office continued to reject the Valentine project, maintaining its official position that the two-man turret did not meet Doctrine, and 60 millimeters of armor was insufficient, demanding a three-man turret, 75 millimeters of armor, and a fourth crew member. Vickers continued to work on the project without an official order, with Little refining the design, eliminating minor issues, and preparing documentation, all on the company's funds and without any guarantee that the tank would ever be adopted. This was a serious corporate risk, but Vickers possessed an argument that grew weightier with each passing month. While the military argued over turret seats, real infantry tanks in the British Army were catastrophically scarce. The Matilda I had only a machine gun and no cannon, while the Matilda II was a good machine but slow and expensive to produce, leaving the Army in desperate need of a third option, and fast. In 1939, the situation changed dramatically. On September 1st, war began in Europe. The British Army started deploying troops to the continent, and the industry received urgent orders for equipment. It was then that a painful truth emerged. Matilda II production was too slow for wartime, as factories could not keep up because each machine required significant assembly time, specialized workers, and scarce components. Vickers seized the moment, returning to the War Office with a simple argument. You do not have time for an ideal tank. You only have time for a tank that can be made quickly and in large quantities, and that tank is ready and standing right here. The military hesitated, but their choices were dwindling. In the end, a compromise was reached that satisfied both sides enough to move forward. The tank was accepted exactly as Little insisted, with a two-man turret, 60 millimeters of armor, and a combat weight of 16 tons. The armament was replaced with a 2-pounder, that is, 40mm semi-automatic gun, which was the standard British anti-tank weapon of the time and well understood by the industry. On April 4, 1940, the infantry tank Mark III was officially adopted by the British Army. Not the Valentine. Its official designation was the Mark III, while the name Valentine remained merely an internal working name of Vickers, only officially assigned in September 1941. Here lies that very detail with the designation. Almost all British tanks of the interwar period and the start of the war received a War Office index starting with the letter A and a serial number. A9 was Cruiser Tank Mark I, A10 was Cruiser Tank Mark II, A11 was Infantry Tank Matilda I, and A12 was Infantry Tank Matilda II. This index was assigned the moment a project was officially accepted for consideration, meaning when the War Office agreed to evaluate the machine. The Valentine was never given this treatment because they did not accept it for consideration. They rejected it, and then rejected it again, until circumstances forced the military to agree, bypassing the standard procedure without assigning an A index. Thus, it turned out that the only British infantry tank to become truly mass-produced during the war lacks the standard designation of its class peers, which is not a technical coincidence but a trace of conflict written directly into the documentation. In April 1940, the first prototype of the Mark III was ready, and in June of that year, the first 7 machines went to the troops. The Army received what it needed, the industry received an order it could fulfill, and Leslie Little received confirmation of what he had known all along. Production volumes began to grow rapidly. In less than 6 months, almost as many machines were produced as during an entire year of Matilda II production, and the pace grew even faster. By September 1941, when the tank was officially renamed the Valentine, 1,095 machines had already been built, meaning the tank that had been rejected twice became the most mass-produced British tank of that time. Now, it remained to see how it would fight. North Africa was not the environment for which the Valentine was designed, which is important to understand from the outset. Not because the tank was bad, but because the desert imposes unique requirements on machinery, some of which the Valentine simply could not meet by its very nature. In November 1941, the British 8th Army began Operation Crusader, an offensive in Libya aimed at relieving the siege of Tobruk, featuring several hundred Valentines of various modifications. The first thing the crews noted was its reliability. In the desert, equipment operates in harsh conditions. Fine sand penetrates every gap. Daytime summer temperatures reach 40 degrees in the shade, and much higher inside an armored vehicle under direct sunlight, and at night, the temperature drops sharply. These colossal temperature fluctuations presented a serious test for engines, filters, and suspensions. The Valentine managed this, not perfectly, as air filtration required constant attention and sand took its toll, but quite decently compared to some other British vehicles of the period. In 1941, the 60mm armor provided real protection, as German 37mm anti-tank guns could not penetrate it from normal distances, although 50mm guns were a problem, especially at close range. Overall, however, the machine held its ground where lighter tanks did not. The crews appreciated this, as the feeling of being protected in battle is a concrete advantage. But there was a problem, and a serious one: 25 kilometers per hour. In urban combat, in offensives through fortified positions, and in infantry support, this speed was normal, as an infantry tank is not meant to race but to walk with the soldiers, cover them, and work methodically. In the desert, the rules were different. The North African theater of operations consisted of vast open spaces where maneuver decided everything. Flanking the enemy, reaching a favorable position first, or retreating from an attack to strike again all required speed. 25 kilometers per hour in open terrain was a death sentence in certain situations. German anti-tank gunners in North Africa knew how to choose positions and operate at long ranges, making a slow-moving tank in an open space an easy target with almost no chance to maneuver out of danger. British tankers understood this very well. There was also a second problem: the lack of high-explosive shells for the 40mm gun. The 2-pounder was a good anti-tank gun by the standards of 1940 to 1941, firing armor-piercing shells reliably, but virtually no proper high-explosive shell existed for it. This meant that against infantry, artillery crews, and field fortifications, the Valentine was significantly less effective than an infantry support tank ought to be. The irony is obvious. An infantry tank designed to support infantry could not effectively engage enemy infantry. This was not Little's fault. The 2-pounder was the standard armament of British tanks of the period, and the lack of a proper high-explosive shell affected the entire line of British armor, not just the Valentine, but the fact remained. By the spring of 1943 in North Africa, the Valentine was being actively replaced by the American Sherman, not because the Valentine was a failure, but because the Sherman was faster, had a 75mm gun with proper high-explosive shells, and was better suited to the nature of combat in open terrain. This is an honest assessment. The Valentine did not lose North Africa to itself. It lost to conditions it was never created for. But what is telling is that while the British military gradually withdrew the Valentine from African units, production statistics continued to grow, with factories running at full capacity and building machines by the hundreds. Where were they going? Some remained in British units in other theaters of war, where conditions differed. Some went to crew training, and some were converted into specialized vehicles. But there was another major destination, thousands of kilometers from North Africa, on an entirely different front, where the Valentine found a use that none of its creators had fully foreseen. There, it was not replaced by American tanks. Instead, the Soviets kept asking for more, and more, and more. This story is far more interesting than the African one. To understand why the Valentine was so in demand in the Soviet Union, we must return to a problem that existed in the Red Army from the very start of the war and had no simple solution. In the 1930s, the main light tank of the Soviet armored forces was the T-26, a machine created on the basis of that very 6-ton Vickers Mark E, the British design we mentioned at the beginning. The Soviet Union bought the license, modified the design, and produced it serially starting in 1931. The T-26 was a decent machine for its time, but by 1941, its time had passed. Its armor was obsolete, its engine was weak, and its range was short, causing the T-26 to suffer enormous losses in the first months of the war. A replacement was needed, a light infantry support tank that was maneuverable, sufficiently protected, and equipped with a decent gun. There was the T-50 project, which Soviet designers had been working on since 1939. On paper, it was supposed to be exactly what was needed, a modern infantry tank weighing about 14 tons, with up to 37mm of armor and a good engine. However, the story of the T-50 turned out to be long and painful, as production could not pick up the pace. The factory in Leningrad, where it was assembled, wound up in the blockade zone, and evacuation, component shortages, and a lack of capacity turned the T-50 from a solution into a problem itself. Throughout the war, just over 60 machines were produced, a drop in the ocean for an army that needed thousands. The niche for an infantry support tank was left empty. It was at this moment that Valentines began to arrive under Lend-Lease, the American program under which the United States transferred military equipment, materials, and food to allies as loans or leases, with Great Britain and Canada also participating in deliveries under this system. The first Valentines arrived in the Soviet Union at the end of 1941, and it immediately became clear that the machine hit the mark. This was not because the Valentine was the best tank of the war, but because it fit the vacant niche very well. At 16 tons, it was light enough to avoid problems with bridges and crossings. Its 60mm of armor provided serious protection for a vehicle of its class, and its 40mm gun was a fully viable anti-tank weapon by the standards of 1941 to 1942. Most importantly, it was reliable. In the conditions of the Soviet theater of war, with its mud, freezing temperatures, and vast distances between repair bases, reliability was not a secondary quality, but a primary requirement. Soviet crews also noted another feature. The Valentine was low, noticeably lower than most other tanks in its class, and a smaller silhouette meant a lower probability of being hit in open terrain, which is tangible in battle. Furthermore, it was quiet. The diesel engine ran much more quietly than a petrol engine, which was valuable in night operations and stealthy deployments. The Soviet command quickly drew its conclusions. Requests for Valentine deliveries were made persistently and consistently. These were not mere suggestions, but urgent demands specifying that they wanted this exact tank in the maximum possible quantities, rather than the American Stuart or the British Churchill. This speaks volumes. When an army fighting incredibly difficult battles chooses a specific machine among several options and insists on it, it is not a whim of supply officers, but an evaluation based on real combat experience. Now, regarding production, here is a detail that surprises even those well acquainted with Lend-Lease history. Almost all Valentines delivered to the Soviet Union were manufactured not in Great Britain, but in Canada. The Canadian plant, Montreal Locomotive Works, mastered Valentine production and turned them out in huge quantities, as Canada became one of the largest producers of armored vehicles among the Allies during World War II, with the Valentine as one of its main products. The Canadian-built machines differed in several ways, notably featuring American General Motors 6004 diesel engines with an actual output of around 160 horsepower. The Soviet side particularly valued these machines because a diesel engine meant less fire hazard than a petrol engine. In total, more than 3,300 Valentines of various modifications were delivered to the Soviet Union, making it the most numerous foreign tank in the Red Army throughout the war. Deliveries began in late 1941 and lasted longer than those of any other Lend-Lease tank, with the final vehicles arriving in the autumn of 1944, amounting to nearly 3 years of continuous, uninterrupted supply, which no other foreign tank achieved. In Soviet documentation, the machine was most often referred to simply as the Mark III, sometimes as the Valentine, and was classified sometimes as a light tank and sometimes as a medium tank, depending on the context and period. This classification confusion is telling. The machine did not fit standard Soviet categories precisely because it occupied its own unique niche, a niche that Soviet industry never managed to fill on its own. But the Valentine did not stand still during this time. While thousands of machines fought on the Eastern Front, designers worked to make them better, and what they did with this tank during the war deserves a separate discussion. When an engineer creates a good design, it has one characteristic property: it grows. This does not mean physical size, although that happens, but rather potential, as a good basic design allows the installation of more powerful weapons and more modern components to solve new problems without starting the design from scratch each time. The Valentine worked exactly this way, and the history of its modifications is essentially a story of how accurately Little calculated the safety margin of his design. Let us start from the beginning. Mark I was the first production version with an AECA 189 petrol engine of 150 horsepower, a two-man turret, a 40mm 2-pounder gun, a crew of 3, and a combat weight of 16 tons, entering service in the summer of 1940. Mark II marked the transition to a different petrol engine, the British Bedford Twin 6 of 170 horsepower, bringing a slight improvement in mobility but no fundamental changes otherwise. Mark III and Mark IV transitioned to the AECA 190 diesel engine, which was an important decision because diesel fuel is less flammable than petrol. In combat, this is the difference between a tank that catches fire from a fragment hitting the fuel tank and one that does not, which is why the Soviet side highly valued the diesel versions. Mark V transitioned to the American General Motors 6004 diesel engine, the one with an actual output of around 160 horsepower, despite the official 125, which became the standard engine for most Canadian machines shipped to the Soviet Union. Up to this point, all changes mainly concerned the engines and minor refinements, while the turret remained a two-man design and the gun remained a 40mm. The military continued to insist on a three-man turret, and designers finally found a solution. The Mark IX was a fundamental step forward. The turret was enlarged, not by complete redesign, which would have required a major hull overhaul, but by expanding the existing structure just enough to accommodate a third crew member. The turret ring diameter was increased to a size that allowed the installation of a new, more powerful gun. This gun was the 6-pounder, that is, 57mm, cannon, which by the standards of 1942 to 1943 was a serious anti-tank weapon that penetrated armor that the 2-pounder gun struggled with or could not penetrate at all. The Mark X featured the same 3-man turret with the 6-pounder gun, but used an American diesel engine instead of a British one, essentially making it a Canadian version of the Mark IX. Finally, the Mark XI was the pinnacle of the line, equipped with a 75mm gun. This weapon gave the Valentine what it had lacked from the very beginning: a proper high-explosive shell. The 75mm gun fired full-fledged high-explosive ammunition, allowing the tank to work effectively not only against armored vehicles, but also against enemy infantry, field fortifications, and artillery crews. This had been the weak point of early versions, and in the end, the Valentine's design withstood the installation of a weapon that no one had even thought of in 1938, demonstrating what a properly chosen margin of safety really means. For comparison, let us look at the Matilda II, the vehicle considered the gold standard of British infantry tanks in 1940, with its 78mm armor, serious protection, and good reputation. The Matilda remained with its 2-pounder gun almost until the end of its career in the British Army, as installing a more powerful weapon in its turret proved impossible due to the turret ring being too small, showing that the design left no room for growth. The Valentine did, and designers took advantage of it. Now, about the self-propelled guns. Here the story becomes even more interesting. In the British Army, there was an acute need for self-propelled artillery, guns mounted on an armored chassis capable of moving with the troops, which required a chassis that was reliable, wide enough to accommodate the gun, and preferably already mastered by industry. The choice fell on the Valentine. The first self-propelled gun based on its chassis was the Bishop, adopted in 1942 and used in North Africa. The Bishop carried the standard British QF 25-pounder gun howitzer of 87.6 millimeters, which was the main British field artillery system of the period. The appearance of the Bishop was, to put it mildly, peculiar. The gun was located in a tall, rectangular armored superstructure that towered over the Valentine's hull rather impressively. The resulting silhouette was very conspicuous, which is not the best quality for self-propelled artillery. Additionally, the gun's elevation angle was restricted by the superstructure's design, reducing its maximum firing range compared to the towed version of the same gun. Nevertheless, the Bishop fought in North Africa and then in Italy, serving as a functional, if not ideal, vehicle. The second self-propelled gun on the Valentine chassis was the Archer, which deserves special attention. The Archer carried the QF 17-pounder anti-tank gun of 77mm, which was one of the best Allied anti-tank guns of the war, capable of penetrating the armor of heavy German Tiger and Panther tanks at normal combat ranges, which was critical by 1944. However, the Archer had a design feature that caused confusion for anyone seeing the vehicle for the first time. The gun was mounted facing backward, toward the rear of the vehicle, meaning that the crew had to aim the gun in the direction opposite to the tank's travel. This was not a mistake or a designer's eccentricity, but a necessary compromise, as the 17-pounder gun had a long barrel and powerful recoil, making it impossible to mount facing forward on the Valentine chassis without a major hull redesign, because the barrel would protrude too far beyond the vehicle's dimensions. With the rearward installation, everything fit much better. In practice, this yielded an unexpected advantage. After firing, the crew could immediately drive away toward cover, moving engine first and gun back, meaning they could fire and immediately withdraw, which was a viable tactic for ambushes. The Archer entered service in 1944 and was used in Western Europe, and unlike some other British self-propelled projects of the period, it managed to see real action. Here is a revealing comparison. The Matilda II, which was more famous, better protected, and had a better reputation at the start of the war, never served as the basis for a single combat self-propelled gun that saw real action throughout its service. Meanwhile, the Valentine, a tank twice rejected, accepted without enthusiasm, and considered a compromise, gave the Army 2 self-propelled guns that both participated in actual combat. A design either leaves room for growth or it does not, and the Valentine did, while the Matilda did not, which was not an accident but the result of the choice Leslie Little made in 1938 when he refused to inflate the vehicle beyond measure. It remained only to see where this machine arrived in the end, and who met it there. In the spring of 1945, British tankers saw a strange sight. Among the equipment moving through Germany in the final months of the war, Valentines occasionally appeared, not as museum exhibits or training vehicles, but as active combat units in frontline regiments. The men who fought in these machines knew their history. They knew the Valentine was adopted in April 1940, and that by 1943 it was already being replaced by American tanks in North Africa. So it was logical to assume that by 1945, this machine had long since retired. Yet it was here, in Germany, in 1945. This in itself is a testament. Not every machine survives to the end of the war for which it was created, as many tanks adopted in 1939 to 1940 became history by 1943, obsolete, discontinued, and forgotten, while the Valentine continued to serve. Why? The answer is simple yet profound. Because the British Army always found a task for which the Valentine was better suited than anything else, whether in training units, auxiliary detachments, specialized vehicles based on its chassis, or theaters of war where heavy armor was excessive and light armor was insufficient. A 16-ton vehicle with a reliable diesel engine, armor that stops most shrapnel and light shells, and a gun that solves most tasks will always find a use, even when more powerful and modern tanks appear. This is the very definition of a workhorse. While the Valentine lived to see victory, the British Army was already working on its successor, a story that deserves a separate mention because it best explains why Leslie Little was right. The tank was named the Valiant, officially designated as Infantry Tank Mark V, and this time the military was given complete freedom to formulate requirements, with no little refusing to redesign the project and no compromises with industry. The Army wanted exactly what the Army wanted, and they got it. What was the result? The Valiant weighed 27 tons, featured up to 100 millimeters of armor in the frontal section, and had a 3-man turret, everything the military had demanded since 1938. The engine was a Bedford petrol engine of 210 horsepower, which sounded like a lot on paper, but in practice, this power was barely enough to move 27 tons of armor, resulting in a maximum speed of about 24 kilometers per hour on the highway, roughly the same as the Valentine, which weighed 11 tons less. Its cross-country mobility turned out to be unsatisfactory, as the ground pressure, the load per unit area of the track, was too high for a machine meant to move alongside infantry on any terrain. Its reliability also drew complaints due to its complex design, high weight, and overloaded components, all of which made themselves felt during trials. The Valiant was adopted in 1944, but did not participate in combat, not because the war ended early, but simply because the vehicle did not meet the requirements of real service. The military, given complete freedom of action, created a tank that did not work as an infantry tank should, confirming Little's 1938 predictions, though by 1944, there was no one left to admit it aloud. Against this background, consider another story. The most mass-produced British light tank of World War II was the American Stuart, and the most mass-produced British medium tank of World War II was the American Sherman. The British tank industry, which had invented this class of technology, ended the war equipping its own army predominantly with American machines. This was not a catastrophe or a failure in a global sense, as the Allies fought together and equipment went where it was needed, but it was a telling result for the country that in 1916 was the first in the world to use tanks in battle. Amidst this, the Valentine stands apart, the only British tank produced in truly mass quantities, more than 5,800 machines during the war. The only one delivered continuously to Allies for nearly 3 years. The only one whose chassis gave the Army 2 combat self-propelled guns that actually fought. And the only British tank of this period that continued to serve in various armies of the world for a decade and a half after the end of World War II, in New Zealand, India, and several other countries. This was not because it was the best, but because it was reliable, simple, easy to maintain, and sufficient for the task. In the final analysis, this is what distinguishes good engineering from brilliant engineering. Brilliant work looks impressive on paper, while good work works in the field for years, in any conditions, long after more modern things have been scrapped or burned. Leslie Little created a tank that worked in the field, and in the spring of 1945, as this machine entered Germany, no one remembered that it had been rejected twice, and no one considered it a compromise. It was simply there, as always, which is the best characteristic that can be given to any combat vehicle.